See? Okay, so good afternoon. Welcome to the second part of our afternoon session. I've been asked to chair also the second part because I was supposed to be able to handle the technology, which I'm not, but now apparently it is working, but I'm not saying it too loud because otherwise the gods would punish me. So the topic of my paper is the retrospective of New American Cinema works organized in Italy in May 1967 in Turin. At the Unione Culturale, which you already know was a left-wing cultural organization, very active at the time and still alive and kicking, as our friends here will tell us. I presented a first version of this paper last year at the conference of the Society for Cinema and Media Studies in a panel that included some of the speakers of today. And for that presentation, I researched the papers regarding the 1967 retrospective held by the Unione Culturale. Okay. Moreover, I interviewed a few people who attended the retrospective itself: experimental filmmaker Tonino Bernardi, painter and sculptor Ugo Nespolo, who also made several experimental films, and Paolo Bertetto, who at the time was a young film critic and, as you know from this morning, later became an academic with a specific interest in avant-garde cinema. After some more work that I presented last April at a seminar in Stockholm organized by Miguel Fernandez Labayen and John Soldom, it is clear that there is a connection, some kind like the French connection, working on New American cinema on both sides of the Atlantic. I very recently saw a few more papers held by Susanna Fadini, whom I thank, along with Unione Culturale. Susanna is the daughter of late Edoardo Fadini, who, as you will see in a few minutes, plays a very important role in the story I am about to tell. I will start by briefly sketching the context in which the 67 retrospective was held. Then I will analyze the content of the retrospective and the way it was organized. Finally, I will close with a few remarks on the impact of the retrospective on the Italian film culture. As you know from Faye Corthésy's paper, the 67 Turin retrospective was not the very first retrospective of New American cinema films that took place in Italy. The first one in the whole world, actually, according to Faye's extensive and very important research, was held in Spoleto in the summer of '61 at the Festival dei Due Mondi. But even if that was the UR retrospective, the Spoleto program had a relatively modest impact on the Italian cultural scene. In all the documents, letters, and articles regarding the Torino's retrospective that I saw, the Spoleto screenings are never mentioned. On the one hand, it is self-evident that the organizer of the new retrospective had an interest in presenting their program as the first one. But on the other hand, also journalists and critics with no connection with the exposition of 1967 never mentioned the Spoleto program. I do not know exactly why the memory of Spoleto was erased. Maybe '61 was too early. There was no real interest in Italy for underground cinema at the time, while the late 60s were probably a more interesting time because a young generation of avant-garde artists and enthusiasts was emerging. Also, maybe the Festival dei Due Mondi, dominated by non-avant-garde figures such as Luchino Visconti, was not the ideal place to start, but as I said, I should investigate more closely this question. On the contrary, the Unione Culturale in Turin, notwithstanding the relatively marginality of both the institution and the city, was a good place to start a revolution. I use the expression marginality because Turin was, and still is, what the Americans call a second city, always one step behind Milan or Rome, if you want. In the late 60s, Torino was a sleepy, conformist provincial city, basically owned by Fiat, and what Fiat did not control was controlled either by the Catholic Church or the Communist Party. So, not much fun in Torino. I was there in the 70s and 80s, and I know what I'm talking about. So, from this perspective, Turin seems a very unlikely place to present experimental films made by a bunch of bohemians from the Greenwich Village. But albeit being a provincial factory town, or maybe precisely because it was a provincial factory town, Turin could count on small but very active artistic and intellectual groups. The New American Cinema retrospective of May 67, far from being something that came out of the blue, was part of a large network of innovative cultural experiences, experimental stage performances, many of which directly connected to the Unione Culturale, and conferences and readings by prominent artists and scholars. Just a week before the retrospective, as Ron Gregg already underlined, and in strong connection with the retrospective, the Living Theatre presented Frankenstein at the Teatro Alfieri, a few blocks from the Unione Culturale. It was the European premiere. In September, the Hellas Bookshop, just on the other side of the street from the Unione Culturale, invited no less than Allen Ginsberg. So, if Turin was a sleepy provincial town, it could dream really wild dreams. And one of its main dream makers was Edoardo Fadini. No, this is Frankenstein. This is Edoardo Fadini. Fadini, the mighty force behind the New American Cinema retrospective, as well as many other first-class cultural events. As some of you might know, Edoardo Fadini was a drama critic, writing for L'Unità, the official organ of the Italian Communist Party, and other publications such as Sipario, one of the main Italian theater magazines. Fadini was also the vice president of the Unione Culturale, cultural association linked to the Communist Party, where he was in charge of the program, a very rich program indeed, with stage shows, film screenings, conferences, and roundtables. Reading Fadini's correspondence at the Unione Culturale, you see that from his relatively unimportant position, a not so well-known association in a not so well-known city, Fadini had contacts with some of the most prominent experimental artists of his time, from writer and filmmaker Alain Robbe-Grillet to stage directors such as Peter Brooks, Judith Malina, and Julian Beck. Again, the Unione Culturale, being connected to the Communist Party, was not supposed to be particularly receptive of this kind of art. The Italian Communist Party, albeit being the most heterodox communist party in Europe, in the artistic domain was committed to realism and very suspicious of any kind of avant-garde art seen as an expression of bourgeois individualism. One of Fadini's great qualities was that he was able to work inside the institutions of official left-wing culture under the very eyes of party leaders, promoting art forms that the party was not supposed to endorse. If you read the article that Fadini wrote on the New American Cinema Exposition in the issue of Sipario of June 67, so right after the exposition, his strategy is very clear. On the one hand, you see a very refined critic who works on the stylistic quality of the film, of the films he analyzes, comparing the structure of Breckage's and Markopoulos movies with Webern's and Stockhausen's compositions. On the other hand, he underlines the political dimension of these movies. The article opening is very clear. Quote, according to me, all these stories of the New American cinema is terribly serious, serious as drugs and nuclear missiles, unquote. He underlines the political nature of these films not only because he believes in revolutionary art, but also because he knows that in order to get the attention of the Italian non-mainstream film audience, which was very political, this kind of approach was necessary. It was thanks to his connection with the living theater that Fadini got in touch with Jonas Mekas. In the summer of 1966, Fadini travels to Jerome's Hill mansion in southern France that Ronald Gregg talked about in Cassis, where the living theater, as we saw in Ron's paper, is encamped. There, according to a non-dated typewritten text that Susanna Fadini showed me, and that probably is the first draft of the Sipario article I showed you before, in Cassis, Fadini meets Jonas Mekas, who, according to Fadini, stared at him for 3 days, I'm quoting, with great suspect and distrust. When Fadini invites Mekas to show the American experimental films in Turin, Mekas replies with curses. Si lasciò sfuggire soltanto maledizioni. But in the end, Mekas accepted the offer, presenting a first tentative list of films to show. A list that then grew a lot. So probably Mekas was, also quite smart. He said, okay, I'll send you 12 films, and then the films became more and more. As I said, this was happening in the summer of 66. The retrospective will take place in May 67. Between these two dates, there is a sort of a little rehearsal in January 67, when Taylor Mead comes to Italy, traveling in pure beatnik style, a sleeping bag and a few film cans. On January 31, at the Unione Culturale, there is a screening of Ron Rice's Queen of Sheba Meets the Atom Man, introduced by Mead, who, instead of the Queen of Sheba, meets two local experimental filmmaker wannabes, Tonino Di Bernardi and Paolo Menzio. According to De Bernardi, whom I interviewed, Taylor Mead was in love with Turin, which he found, I'm quoting, very similar to New York. If he ever said that, I guess Taylor Mead was stoned. But anyway, especially the Turin of 1967. But anyway, it's a nice thing to do, to say. He became friend with De Bernardi and acted along with Allen Ginsberg in Il Mostro Verde, the Green Monster, which is also mentioned in the first season of True Detective, but I don't think it's the same Green Monster. Il Mostro Verde, the filmic debut of De Bernardi and Menzio. So, after this first reconnaissance by Taylor Mead, preparations for the all-out invasion started. Reading the letters between Fadini, Hill, and Mekas, it is very clear that the process was not particularly smooth. At the beginning, Hill acts as a mediator between Fadini and Mekas, but at the end of March, the two start to directly correspond. On March 28, Mekas sends Fadini a list of films, much longer than the one he gave him in Cassis. This is a photograph from the regional program of the Unione Culturale, and this is the program of the retrospective organized in 2017 by the Fondazione Prada in Milan. This list is divided into 14 sessions, all decided by Mekas. It is basically the program, the list he sends in March 28 by letter. It is basically the program of the retrospective. The only difference is a last 15 session that in Mekas' letter was only evoked, but without a specific title. As you can see, the retrospective included the most prominent authors of American underground cinema, as you already know, from Mekas to Stan Brakhage, from Andy Warhol to Gregory Makropoulos. In total, the retrospective included 63 films. The program does not mention all the titles, and this is the complete list, which I already show you. Okay. After the letter from March 28, Mekas remains silent for 1 month, and Fadini starts to be worried. He writes to Jerome Hill to have news. On April 27, Mekas writes again, apologizing for his silence, but also complaining about money. the Unione Culturale is willing to pay only for the travel expenses of Jonas Mekas and his companions, Jerome Hill and Taylor Mead, as well as for the shipment of the copies. New prints were made and paid by the filmmakers cooperative and probably by Jerome Hill himself. Mekas says that underground directors deserve to be paid for their work. They need financial support in their struggle against Hollywood. But sensing that Fadini would be unable to pay more, Mekas accept to give him the films for free. This is not the only reference to the connection between art and money made by Mekas. In Turin, during a presentation, he laments the poor quality of the projection at the Galleria d'Arte Moderna, the modern art gallery, where the screenings took place, because the gallery had a larger theater than the one at the Unione Culturale. Moreover, Mekas says that the film equipment is too expensive in Italy. This is why there is no independent cinema in the country. In New York City, almost anybody can afford buying a 16mm camera. In retrospective, in the interview he gave me, De Bernardi agrees with Mekas. At the beginning of his career, he could not even afford a Super 8 camera. He had to buy an 8mm camera. I will come back on the money issue at the end of my paper. The screenings went on for 10 days, with presentations by Mekas, Hill, and Mead, who discussed the films with the public, who was generally very responsive. On the last day, there was a final roundtable at the Unione Culturale with various Italian film critics and also with Fernanda Pivano. Here it is. Here she is. Fernanda Pivano, as you know, was a literary translator, sort of an ambassador of the American beat culture to Italy. Some critics, such as Gianni Rondolino, who later became a university professor, were very supportive, but Guido Aristarco, one of the most well-known Marxist film critics, was openly against these American films. According to Aristarco, the new American cinema group films were not inventive at all. They were simply remaking experiments already made by the European avant-gardes in the 20s. Moreover, they were not really revolutionary, but part of the capitalist system. The discussion became so tense that the girl who had been hired to work as the official translator could not stand it, and she had to be relieved by Fernanda Pivano. In the context of the audience of the retrospective, Aristarco definitely belonged to a minority. As I said, most of the people who attended the screenings enjoyed these films. But, and I am coming to the end of my paper, what about the impact of the retrospective on the Italian film culture in general? The retrospective did very well. The theater of the Modern Art Gallery was always packed. What kind of people attended the screenings? Mostly young people, young cinephiles, or young men and women interested in contemporary art, but also young people just looking for any kind of experience that could help them fleeing mainstream culture and middle-class life. So maybe this is why it started in Torino and it did so well, precisely because Torino had less to offer to these people than a more international city as Milan or Rome. In a few months, these young people would march in the streets promoting the so-called contestazione generale, total dissent against family, religion, the capitalist system, and so on. Turin would be in the avant-garde at the time. The iconic year of the European Youth Revolt is 1968, but in Turin, it started a little bit before that. Because in late November 1967, when the university students occupied Palazzo Campana, which was the humanities building at the time. Mekas and his friends were definitely in tune with the time. As Tonino De Bernardi puts it, American experimental movies were showing a new way of living. The audience of the retrospective was mostly local, but the films traveled around Italy, as we already know. In the following months, Fadini, who was acting as the group's agent, basically, showed the films at the Pesaro Film Festival, as well as in several other towns. The only exception is Rome. The films arrived in Rome, but not through Fadini, because Lino Michiché, and I'm talking to the people who knew Lino Michiché, was smart enough to outmaneuver Fadini and get a contact directly with the Americans. So Rome was the only city outside, the Fadini mob. And there is a very funny letter from Michiché to Fadini, because, I mean, clearly they quarreled on the control of the retrospective, but then Michiché was smart enough to basically giving him a couple of advice on how getting funds from the ministry, because Michiché was in Rome, so he had good connections with the under government. And so, I mean, as a way to repay Fadini, he gives him a couple of suggestions on how taking some money from the government. So the films traveled extensively around Italy. Did these screenings really have an impact on the Italian film culture? On the one hand, yes, the retrospective was a real starting point for the Italian underground cinema. The Turin retrospective offered a chance to young Italian experimental filmmakers not only to watch the works of their American older brothers, but also to show their own films, films that until then they had been doing almost unnoticed. In the very same year, various Italian experimental filmmakers founded a cooperative openly inspired by Meccas. Did it work? To make a long story short, no, it did not work. Basically, for two reasons. One is money. The Italian audience was too small. There weren't enough people interested in experimental films to support these productions. But why not enough people? We come to the second reason, which is culture. The Italian film culture of the late 60s and 70s was strongly linked to Marxism and political militantism. The majority of progressive critics and spectators advocated a militant art with explicit social and political contents. They were fine with Godard, but not with Meccas. This doomed the project of an underground Italian cinema from the very beginning. In the long run, the only Italian experimental films that extensively circulated were those made by visual artists, such as Ugo Nespolo, who always included his films in the exposition of his works organized around the world. Thank you. Okay, now. Okay, fine, it is working. I won't say anything. So now I introduce Claudio Panella and Silvia Nugara from the University of Turin and the Unione Culturale, who will present a paper titled Rediscovering the Italian Reception of New American Cinema Through the Archives of the Unione Culturale. Very well, I leave you the stage, please.
So to save your time is Silvia speaking, and I disappear behind the PC.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Giaime. Thank you to our university for inviting us as members of the UC. We'll call ourselves, Unione Culturale UC, just to make it short. So I will refer to it as UC all the time. So the aim of a paper, which I will present, but we joined forces with Claudio to write. The aim of this paper is to offer you a guided tour through the presence of NAC in the archives of UC, the cultural association we work for, and which is, as Giaime said, the first to organize an exposition here in Turin, a showcase here in Turin of the NAC in '67. Firstly, we're going to present the structure of our archives, which is an archive mainly witnessing the cultural activity of UC itself, and which is no longer, since 2015, in the original venue of UC, in the undergrounds of Palazzo Carignano. We are still working. Now the archives, fortunately, because the undergrounds of Palazzo Carignano are very damp, but actually now the archives are in a new and better venue, which is the Polo del Novecento, and it's a cultural center which the UC contributed to found, to organize. And there's a library, there's archives dealing with the history of the second part of the 20th century. So today we can show you a few examples of the materials we preserve on NAC. And part of this material has recently been digitalized within the frame of a project of this university. The project is DG15, a project scientifically supervised by Professor Giulia Carloccio. And within this framework, our scope was mainly to preserve letters, telegrams, programs, leaflets, posters, and other kind of printed document of the UC activity in the late 60s. So, as Professor Alonge said, after a few years without a proper venue, UC reopens in the springtime of 1966 in the undergrounds of Palazzo Carignano with a brand new theater. Palazzo Carignano is an historical palace in the center of Turin, mainly known for being the place where the unification of Italy was proclaimed, obviously a century before. At the time, the president of UC was Franco Antonicelli, a former member of the anti-fascist resistance, but also a man of letters, a literary critic, a publisher. He's mainly known as being the first to publish If This Is a Man by Primo Levi, earlier, before Einaudi published it. The statement Franco Antonicelli writes at the opening of the UC season 66-67, which was printed on the program that you see here on the slide, but was also cited on the newspaper L'Unità, said that the aim of UC was, sorry for my translation, but everything is in Italian, obviously, but he says that the aim of UC is to break the lazy stillness, the lazy quietness of our city. The driving force behind the program of this first season after the reopening is, as we know from Giaime, Edoardo Fadini, thanks to whom the very opening night on the 5th of May, '66, the Living Theatre was on stage with mysteries and smaller pieces. So here in this picture, you can see the president of Fiat, Gianni Agnelli, with his brother Umberto enjoying one of the shows of the Living Theatre around those times. The legend goes that Julian Beck at some point threw up on his feet, but we have no documents backing that up. So it's just a legend. Even before the NAC exposition in '67, independent cinema was already at the core of UC programming. One of the very first screenings of the new UC era in '66 was La Verifica Incerta by Baruchello and Griffi, a masterpiece and forerunner of Italian experimental cinema, which, as shown in this letter that we have, a letter by Gianfranco Baruchello, dated 17th of May, 66, had been screened at both the MoMA and the New York Guggenheim in March 66. In Turin, the film was introduced by the poet and critic Edoardo Sanguinetti, who was in charge of the literature programming in UC. And during those very same weeks, Sanguinetti also invited and debated with people such as Roland Barthes, René Girard, Jean Staromansky, Juan Goytisolo. So that was how active and important UC was at the time. The printed program of that season refers to Flavio Ruffatto as the supervisor of the cinema section. Who was this guy, Flavio Ruffatto? Well, he was one of the left-wing independent activists or art students the UC engaged as operational staff. He was a young guy from Ivrea, the city of the technologically and culturally influential firm Olivetti, and a selection of NAC films would be screened in Ivrea later on in July 66. And according to the Olivetti archives, apparently there was a NAC show also in 71. Cinema being his passion, Flavio Ruffatto was appointed head of the contemporary cinema programming, while Gianni Rondolino was in charge of the more historical part. He mostly had an operational role, likewise people such as Silvio De Stefanis and Carlo Repetto, who often appear in the letters and in the paper of UC. In September, October 66, telegrams between UC and Eidermeckes or Hill delay the exposition initially planned for that autumn. Giaime referred to these delays and to this troubled organization. In a letter dated 8 November, Hill reports the screenings to March, April, when him and Mekas might come to Europe, first to France, he says, and then possibly to Turin. As you know, more letters and delays will follow. I would just like to underscore that Hill and UC corresponded in French. While waiting for the NAC, UC hosts a few outstanding other cinema events. Let us look at two examples. First of all, November 66, poet Patrizia Vicinelli, who was very close to that same Alberto Griffi, who co-directed La Verifica Incerta with Baruchello, and who was also very acquainted to poet Edoardo Sanguinetti and his Gruppo 63 literary avant-garde group. She introduced a series of film programs and she performed herself in UC. The programs she presented, she introduced, include the films by Mario Masini, Magda Lomussio, Giorgio Turi, Roberto Capanna. Such names will come back again. So different forms of expression and different disciplines intertwined in those times and obviously in the UC program. But the press was not always eager on that. This article here indicates the critical attitude even of journalists such as Nino Ferrero from l'Unità, who used to follow closely the activities of UC. And we're going to get back later to the Italian independent cinema scene and to the role of Nino Ferrero too. For what concerns American underground films, in January 67, as Giaime said, Taylor Mead comes to town, and there's a press release by UC in our archives qualifying him, quote, as one of the most representative authors of the new American cinema group, unquote. His presence has an impact, especially on young artists such as Tonino De Bernardi and Paolo Menzio, who involved Mead in making and in acting in their first film. Well, here you also see a picture of Mead that we don't actually have, but we found in Pavia, which is a city that holds an archive of papers belonging to Antonicelli, one of the several archives in Italy of papers belonging to Antonicelli. But not only De Bernardi and Menzio were impressed by Taylor Mead, there were also other young filmmakers, other young artists who were very impressed by him, by his passage in Turin. Here in this slide, you can see a part of a letter dated 27th of February 67, signed Collo, Annoni, and Buttafaro. Who were these guys? These three young men had just made together a film called Unci Dunci. It's a cult film from the Turin underground. And in this letter, by this letter, they ask UC for financial support to help them making a documentary on tailor-made. We actually could never find any letter back to them, but the project was there. The project existed. Between the end of winter and the beginning of spring 67, the organization of the NAC exposition takes up again. A letter from Jerome Hill, dated February the 11th, 67, tells Fadini that Mekas needs as much time as possible to gather copies of the films. Also, he underlines that a Swedish film festival is willing to pay for the shipment of NAC films to Europe, which will save Turin such expenses. Plus, he and Mekas will have to travel to Paris around the end of April or beginning of May. At the end of February, Hill tells Fadini about a trip to Rome he must take on the 10th of May, which will allow him to reach Turin 2 days later, when Mekas will join him. He closes by saying, "Je suis bien sensible au fait que ces programmes à Torino vont avoir une grande importance pour la distribution de mes films dans d'autres villes italiennes." On the 11th of March, Hill suggests he brings to Turin prints of The Sandcastle, L'Anticorrida, Open the Door, and Seal the People, and asks whether stills, reviews, and posters are needed for promotion. And we have found in our archives, but also in Pavia's archives, a few of these pictures and film stills. At the end of March, Mekas sends a draft of the program listing a number of available reels selected by him and organized in either 14 or 15 programs. Only Alleluia the Hills had already an Italian distribution. The rest of the films should be shipped by Mekas himself, apart obviously from Jerome Hills. After a long silence, as we know, after that, a long silence sets in. Fadini then urges Mekas by telegram, but on April the 27th, the silence is finally broken by a letter where Mekas explains the reasons for the delay. He forwards the letter he had sent to the filmmakers of the cooperative, announcing the establishment of 3 avant-garde film libraries, one of them being at the Swedish Cinematheque in Stockholm, which apparently never happened. But most of all, he complains about programmers wanting their films for free. And he says, as you can see in the next slide, "You have to keep this in mind. Filmmakers Cinematheque is not like any other cinematheque in the world. Nobody supports us. It's run by filmmakers. To send this exposition to Italy, we had to borrow money for making prints. We'll have to return this money, over $5,000. The young filmmakers of America are leading a difficult and complicated life, surrounded by the commercial cinema. It's easy for you to say that you want our films for nothing. On one hand, you talk about culture and non-profit. On the other hand, you go and you pay money to see stupid commercial movies. But the avant-garde should show you their movies for free. Anyway, we managed to collect enough money to make the prints, and here we are with our culture on the plate." Unquote. So the retrospective finally takes place. Here is the list of tapes and reels shipped to Turin. Well, apparently there were problems at the customs because there was nudity in the films, so the films were stuck at some point, and apparently Agnelli himself had to go to the train station to take them. Here we can see the original printed program of the exposition. And here in the next image, you can see a picture of Mekas taken at the Unione Culturale in 67. And on the other side, there is a still that we have taken from a very brief show, silent a video that ANCR and the National Cinema Archive of Resistance here in Turin has. They put it on YouTube. It's available there. And this short silent video shows Mecca's meeting filmmaker and researcher Paolo Gobetti. And here, on the next slide, you can see a picture of the final debate that took place between writer and translator Fernanda Pivano, who's covering her face with her hand, publisher and playwright Roberto Lerici, and in the middle, film critic Guido Aristarco, who, as you know, was not very keen on NAC. The Turin exposition is crucial for the Italian reception of NAC in two ways. On the one hand, the exposition turns Turin into a key place for the circulation of new cinema all over the country. And on the other hand, a developing new Italian cinema receives inspiration and to a certain extent also legitimization from it. We're now going to briefly address these two aspects by taking a look at some evidences, some documents. Let's start with the distribution. Cinematheques, film festivals, film clubs, and cultural associations write to UC to show interest and to inquire about the availability of film copies as early as April 67. Perhaps one of the first being Genova's Cook, the University Cinema Circle, with a handwritten letter by Aldo Vigano, who would later become a theater and film critic and historian. And he just asks for copies, but we don't have any documents saying that actually anything in Genova took place at the Cook. After Torino, though, part of the exposition goes, as we know, to the Mostra Internazionale del Nuovo Cinema di Pesaro. We have letters from critic Lino Michiche, who was mentioned before, who was the founder, along with Bruno Torri, of that festival. He organized both screenings in Pesaro and in Rome. Several other organizers from Rome write to UC. We have letters from Fernaldo Di Giammatteo, who was planning screenings at the Centro Sperimentale. And most of all, we have a conspicuous number of letters from filmmaker and programmer Annabella Miscuglio on behalf of Film Studio Art House Cinema Club. This is just 4 of them, but we have at least 15 letters from her. Then the film come back from Pesaro and Rome to Turin, as confirmed by Mecas himself in a letter dated June 67. As Fadini says in a letter dated the 30th of May to Annabella Miscuglio, we will hold the films of NAC until next autumn. So they sort of take those films into distribution. Sometimes those films were brought and introduced not only by Mecas, but also by Sydney. A note from the end of April tells about his arrival in Rome with artist and filmmaker Adamo Vergine meeting him at the airport. Vergine is told that Sydney has a beard. Actually, he does. This is another picture we found in Pavia, and the picture has been taken in Unione Culturale, and we still have that lamp, that very lamp that you see in the picture. And Adamo Vergine, we want to mention him because he also played an important role organizing the screenings of NAC in Florence. Here we're presenting a draft program dating end of June 67. We also have pieces such as this telegram about Sydney being in Perugia, where a selection of titles by Markopoulos, Smith, Hill, and Kubelka were screened. Apparently, some films went missing after Sydney's departure. There's a letter complaining about that. And so also these letters show that the UC is considered in charge for the rental fees for the whole distribution. This also appears to be the case when the NAC is distributed to other cities such as Ivrea, as I said, but also Savona and the Como. Here you can see a draft program for Savona printed on Unione Culturale's paper, official paper. So it seems that UC actually conceived that program. And then we also have two letters of Como, where they actually send the money to Turin for the rental of the prints. This kind of correspondence continues on the occasion of the second NAC exposition in '68, to which two-day screenings in December '67 paved the way. On December the 15th, UC screens Harlot by Worrell and Geography of Persia by Sidney, and on the following day, 23rd Sun Branch by Brackage. Adam Sidney was there to introduce the films and meet the audience. The second part of the second NAC exposition took place in UC from the 11th to the 19th of June '68, with films by Kenneth Anger, Hirsch, Goldman, Bartlett, Downey, and Schwiller, among others. And it's a very articulated program, which is also followed by the first English free cinema exposition organized with the London Filmmakers Cooperative. And you know, there in that occasion, a selection of film by Latham, Keane, Stephen Dworskin, but also Corrado Iannelli, who was working in Britain at the time, is shown. Just as it happened in '67, after the second exposition, UC provisionally takes the NAC films into distribution. And here you see the case of Trieste in July '68. At the end of that year, on the 23rd and 24th of October, UC screens a program of films by Markopoulos. And there's a letter here by Markopoulos asking UC for financial support because he wanted to shoot in Italy, and so he apparently thought that UC could financially support this shooting, but actually that never happened as far as our documents are concerned. We're now getting to the last part of our paper, that is the impact of NAC on Cinema Indipendente Italiano, in Italian independent cinema. Here you see a collage with the press coverage of the first NAC exposition. There's a paper, there's an article written by journalist Nino Ferrero, whom I mentioned before, who reports that some young Italian filmmakers showed their work on the last day of the exposition upon Mecca's request. Even before the NAC exposition, UC was already planning, though, a showcase of Italian independent cinema. That is why, with the help of Nino Ferrero himself, Fadini wrote to several young artists and filmmakers, such as Massimo Bacigalupo, asking for copies of their film. Here, Fadini tells Jerome Hill that after the departure of NAC from Turin, young Italian filmmakers, quote, whose research is to a certain extent comparable to yours, unquote, have set up a filmmakers cooperative similar to NAC and with the same goals. Quote, remarkable, isn't it, unquote. Indeed, the cooperative, which Giaime mentioned before, also known as CCI, is created in Naples on the 22nd of May '67 by the Vergine brothers, with a similar organization to the New York cooperative. Still, it is from Torino that many of those films from the cooperative will be distributed, as shown by this letter here, which has enclosed a list of films made in the different cities where the cooperative had members. Many of these films will actually be screened in UC between February and March '68, during the first Rassegna del Cinema Indipendente Italiano, the first independent Italian cinema showcase in February, March '68. We have press releases for each single day of the exposition. Obviously, naming all the films that were shown in that program would be too long. Let us just mention some of the authors who were present: Alfredo Leonardi, Massimo Bacigalupo, Schifano, Ceste, De Bernardi, Pia Premiam, and many more. Each evening had an introduction either by Bertetto, Adamo Vergine, or Gabriele Oriani, a filmmaker himself, and also a very active organizer within the UC in that springtime of '68. The last evening of the screenings was interrupted by a group of people, among whom filmmaker Renato Ferraro, who wanted to make a political statement against the uselessness of art and of avant-garde cinema when revolution was needed. Ferraro soon after joined the barricades in Paris, and Oriani and others left the cooperative to dedicate their effort to the more militant cinereels, cinegiornali, so more militant films and counter-information films. In 2017, we contributed to Milan's Fondazione Prada's homage to the Turin exposition, but we also organized in UC, in the undergrounds, a reunion with all the Italian independent directors and artists who took part to the 67 and 68 American and Italian independent cinema screenings. We invited them to recollect their memories, to interview them, and to, to have a sort of reunion, and it was very intense and very, very lively. We want to express also in this occasion deep gratitude to Fabio Scandura, who organized that evening with us, but who is most of all the author of a very thorough master's dissertation on independent avant-garde and experimental cinema in Turin in the 60s. You see the cover of his dissertation here. It's a real goldmine of information and testimonies. And so we want to thank him, but also thank you very much for your attention.
So now we come to our last speaker, and it is recording. No, it's not recording. Oh, yes, it is recording. Registrazione in corso. It is recording. But we need to open the. I think you can do all alone.
I can try to take care of it.
Okay, no, you will succeed. I'm sure you will. And so I introduce our last speaker, who is Sabrina Negri. She's Italian. She graduated here in Turin. And now she teaches at the University of Colorado Boulder. And her paper is titled The Afterlife of New American Cinema, an Archival Perspective.
All right, give me a second so that I can take care of the technology here. So here's my PowerPoint. Oh, that was easy. Okay. But why is it here too? See, no, that's not good. I hope this is good. Did you see the PowerPoint from here as well? Okay, excellent. All right, thank you for having me here. I have a lot of people to thank. First of all, I want to thank the co-organizers of this beautiful conference, and especially Giaime Alonge for having the idea of organizing it and actually doing most of the legwork. I also want to thank Giulia Muggeo, who designed the beautiful poster for our program. And also I want to thank all the people who helped me with my research, Stefania Carta from the Film Archive here at the National Cinema Museum, Daniela Curro, who worked at the Hagefilm Film Lab in Amsterdam and helped restore these films that you see here that I'm going to discuss later. And I want to also thank Giaime Wagner, who is the film archivist at the University of Colorado Boulder Rare and Distinctive Collection. So as mine is the last talk of the day, actually going off of the last talk on, the archives, what I want to talk about is the not the New American Cinema Group itself, but rather its afterlife. And in particular, its archival afterlife or afterlives, as I'm going to compare the conservation, preservation, and exhibition approaches. Am I sharing my PowerPoint? That's why I was worried that I wasn't seeing that here. Share. Yay. Okay, I don't know where that went, but it doesn't matter. I don't need to see that here, right? No. You see that here? Yeah, okay. Hopefully you see that there too, there in the camera. Okay, so I'm going to compare the conservation, preservation, and exhibition approaches of two archives that house materials related to the work of one of the most prominent members of New American cinema, Stan Brakhage, whose work, as I said, I'm going to approach from an archival perspective, while at the same time approaching archival issues through the work of Brakhage. So the two archives that are at the core of my discussion are, how do I go on? Are the University of Colorado Boulder archives, which house a sizable Brakhage collection in which film is only a small portion of the archival holdings, and the Museo Nazionale del Cinema here in Turin, which on the contrary is primarily a film archive, but owns a few Brakhage films as part of a small collection of American experimental cinema. What I want to think through is the dialectical relationship between film archival materials and the institutions that host them. That is, how the one influences the other and is influenced by it in return. And here I'm talking about film in two different ways. On the one hand, the specific films that are archived and in the Turin case preserved by the institutions. But on the other hand, I'm also thinking about the object film in general, as these two case studies can teach us a lot about theoretical issues that I'm going to touch upon here, even not going to dive too deep into them. In these two archives, and arguably in any film archive, film's nature is revealed to be multifaceted, in a way that goes beyond its being a means for projection, thus broadening our understanding of what film, and therefore cinema, is, and showing how film archiving and preservation function as not only practices or disciplines, but also interpretive frameworks and lenses that allow us to look at cinema from a different perspective. Even though I'm not an experimental cinema scholar, I am particularly interested in this topic because the preservation and archiving of avant-garde cinema challenge traditional standards and theories in use in the field, insofar as experimental works question widely assumed notions of originality, reproducibility, and exhibition. In this sense, experimental cinema already broadens the boundaries of the medium by creating an overlap between cinema and the fine arts, as not only as pertains the medium's aesthetics, but also and especially the medium's material nature, and the aesthetics of its material nature, if you will. So for instance, if we look at this, you can see what I mean. So this is a hand-painted film by Stan Brakhage that is conserved at Boulder, and that is the catalog of an exhibition that I'm going to talk about. So you can see how the object itself is a work of art and not just the film that is projected on the screen, right? It's even signed, which is important, and we will come back later. So this is what makes the preservation of experimental cinema incredibly complicated, but also fascinating and especially instructive. These issues pertain to my broader research on the concepts of uniqueness and originality in film archival and preservation practices. We all know that the nature of cinema, as both a technology and an art form, is widely assumed to be based on mechanical reproducibility. And yet, film archiving and preservation challenge this assumption, as you can see here. As for archivists and preservationists, every single film copy is unique, insofar as it has characteristics that are irreproducible and that make it different from any other copy of the same title. Experimental cinema, with its focus on the materiality and the malleability of the film object, emphasizes an aspect that is proper to any film copy. However, can we say that a unique copy of a film is also an original copy? So what's the difference between uniqueness and originality, and what's the relationship between these two concepts? So there are many elements to take into account to answer this question. In restoration, an original copies usually refer to, the term original, for instance, can be referred to the earliest generation copy of a film. So the camera negative, if you have it, if you don't have that, which is more likely the oldest print that you have at your disposal, for instance. But again, with avant-garde cinema, experimental cinema, this is more complicated, but also simpler if you want, because filmmakers handle, manipulate the film directly, leave a trace that is direct, and therefore the kind of authorship and originality of an experimental film print is different from that of a narrative commercial film, as again, you can see from here. However, as the case of the brackage materials that I'm going to discuss is going to exemplify, things are not so simple when approached from an archival and preservation perspective. And the complications that arise testify to the richness of this approach, so the approach of seeing films in their materiality from an archival perspective, unveiling connections and dynamics that would otherwise remain hidden. So in this case, we're going to observe how two different institutions with different goals, different types of collections, different missions, and a very different relation with Brakhage himself deal with similar materials. In other words, we're going to see how archiving functions as not only a practice, but also, as I mentioned before, an interpretive framework. So in the archives of the University of Colorado Boulder, one can really see the archival life of Stan Brakhage. And I'm using the term life in a fairly literal sense here, because the history of Boulder and the life and work of Stan Brakhage are indissolubly tied. Brakhage lived in Colorado from his childhood, was an active member of the Boulder-Denver area artistic community, was a film professor, where I teach now. Unsurprisingly, the university archives have over 150 boxes dedicated to Stan Brakhage, in addition to film reels, videotapes, audio tapes, and other audiovisual materials. The Brakhage collection was purchased by CU in 2003 and is made up of materials that were collected and stored by Brakhage himself, together with his first wife, Jane, between 1969 and 1987, which was the year of their divorce, even though there were periodic additions until Brakhage's death in 2002. Therefore, this collection reflects the artist's legacy and helped shape the identity of the institution and of the archive itself, where it is housed. It hosts a wealth of material that belonged to the artist: letters, notes, postcards, drawing, books, as you can see here, and of course, film. But what kind of film? And this is, I think, where things get interesting, because this is not exactly the kind of film that you would expect. As some of you may know, most Brakhage films were preserved by the Academy Film Archive in Los Angeles. Some prints are at CU Boulder, but in a different archive that belongs to the Cinema Studies Department. So it's two different collections. And these prints are also interesting as regards the issue of originality, but I'm not going to discuss that, them. But the libraries at Boulder have something different. They have fragments, outtakes, elements that testify of Brakhage's creative work without being finished works in and of themselves. Or to be more precise, by being finished works, but in a different sense. Some film strips are inserted into folders created by Brakhage himself, who never meant to project them, but rather used them as a catalog of techniques and styles. This is consistent with what Mark Toscano writes in his essay, Archiving Brakhage, and I quote, He writes, Stan was incredibly economical, leaving virtually no outtakes in his collection, choosing instead to incorporate the footage he generated into other films, one way or another. Toscano tells the story of Brakhage going over printer test footage that he found in the lab's trim bin in order to reuse it in other films. So the film strips that are conserved as Boulder libraries acquire a twofold meaning. While they testify of Brakhage's reluctance to discard any footage that he created, they're also a rare instance of outtakes that were not incorporated into a new film, but rather conserved as objects that have value in and of themselves, a value that cannot be separated from the rest of the collection. In other words, these outtakes become something else, thus blurring the distinction between film, writing, language, still or moving images, mechanical arts and fine arts, document, and aesthetic object. And I'm going to give you some examples so that you can see what I mean, and also it's more fun to look at things than to hear me speak. So these are materials related to the film Lovemaking that some of you might know by Brakhage. Those of you who know the film might know that it's in 4 parts. So what Brakhage did was he stapled some of the film fragments related to each part into sheets of paper. And he numbered them. Strangely enough, the first part is not in the archive. I don't know if that just doesn't exist or if it got lost over the years. And interestingly enough, he signed each of these sheets of papers as if he were making another work of art with the film made for that specific title. Those are not the only materials related to lovemaking in terms of film. Of course, in terms of papers, there's a lot. But in terms of film, there's also this. So basically, he took other fragments and put them into a film can, and other fragments and put them into a folder. So basically, he took film fragments and would put them in different spaces of the collection so as to kind of make this film lovemaking spread out into the rest of his life and the rest of the materials, which I think is really interesting. Something similar he did with My Mountain Song 27. You can see here there are little pieces of tape with writing. I don't know if you can read, but this is more similar to a sort of storyboard made with film instead of being drawn. This film is on 8mm, so it's even smaller and therefore more delicate to handle. But film in this collection is more than film. And one of my favorite pieces is a letter that he wrote to Stephen Goldstein from the San Francisco Art Institute that looks like this. So speak of film as a language. He writes, Dear Stephen, film, blessings, Stan. If he actually wanted to say something, we'll never know. But I think it's fun to look at for sure, but it's also interesting insofar as it shows that he was literally using film as a language. There's also letters that he received with films. And a letter is from Jace Broughton, the poet from San Francisco, that wrote him a letter that was very personal. He was talking about the kids, that they were playing together. It was so nice that he could send the kids to Colorado to play on the mountains and blah, blah, blah. He also talked about Brakhage's films. And together with the letter, he enclosed this film strip that says, when in doubt, cut. Which might have been a subliminal message to Brakhage, as we were saying about the text of light. Thank God he cuts so often. But what I think is interesting about this is that he uses film, like in this collection, film is a means of communication. But film as an object is a means of communication, not so much film as something that is screened or projected, because of course you cannot screen or project these things. There's more here, but I'm just gonna skip because just for the sake of time, but it's really like fun stuff to look at. The challenges of such a collection from the point of view of conservation, storage, cataloging, and access are enormous, as our archivist friends, I'm sure, can understand. But for the purposes of my talk, what I want to stress is that these film artifacts cannot be separated from the rest of the Brakhage collection, practically or ideally, or even from the folder in which they were put. So they become testimonies of a life, of a creative mind, and on the effect that it had on a community. So keep in mind that, again, this for Brakhage was his local archive, the archive where he grew up, so that these materials are together with his personal stuff. As objects, they take up a life that goes beyond that of the screening or the performance, thus inviting a different mode of exhibition, though limited, of course, by the constraint of the archival setting, and enriching the sets of values that can be attributed to the object film. The case of Turin is a bit different. Actually, it's very different, though, of course, related. The Brakhage collection was purchased by the Cinema Museum in 1997 as part of an effort to expand its experimental cinema collection and honor the city's experimental cinema legacy. As Giaime Alonge has shown earlier in his talk on the relationship between Turin and the New American Cinema Group, these relationships started in 1967 with the famous at this point screening organized by Edoardo Fadini, on whom I'm not going to elaborate because I feel like a lot has been said. In May 1967, a 10-day program of a total of 63 titles premiered in Torino, and I'm going to show the program. I stole this from Giaime, but I asked for his permission after the fact, of course. Interestingly, the program did not premiere in a movie theater, but rather at the Museum of Modern Art, which in itself is an interesting choice. As Faye has unveiled, this was not the first time the program screened in Italy, but from my perspective, it's important because it started a connection between American experimental cinema and the city itself, a connection that would then reverberate on the archival life of the New American Cinema Group and of Stan Brakhage in particular. I need to point out that of the 63 titles that screened at the Museum of Modern Art in 1967, only one was Brakhage's. That one was The Art of Vision, which is 250 minutes long, so probably they thought that one was enough, but was incredibly influential. Among the people who attended the show was Paolo Bertetto, whom we've heard talk this morning. At the time, he was a young film critic, but he would become in the 90s head of the film archive at the National Cinema Museum here in Torino. As such, he did a few things of utmost importance for our purposes. In 1991, he curated another program of American experimental cinema, though at this point it would be a retrospective program called Utopie Americane, American Utopias. Concurrently, he edited this book, The Great Eye of the Night, American Avant-Garde Cinema 1920-1990, and curated the acquisition of what would become the core of the experimental cinema collection at the National Cinema Museum in Turin. Films in the collection feature filmmakers as diverse as Kenneth Anger, Robert Flores, Stan Brakhage, the Italian Ugo Nespolo, who incidentally also was involved with the 67 New American Cinema program in Torino. Some of the titles in the collection had been screened in 1967, thus cementing the connection between that event and the archival life of those films. Still, as we can see, the title of the book says Avant-Garde Cinema 1920-1990. And in fact, the titles acquired by the museum to be screened in its own movie theater go beyond the fateful date of 1967. This is key, as it shows that curator Paolo Bertetto was trying to establish, or to create, if you will, a lineage of American experimental cinema in Turin, of which the gravitational center was the 1967 program, as also is testified in the essays that you can read in this book, including an essay by P. Adam Sidney, where the 1967 program is repeatedly referenced to as the pivotal event. But it's a lineage that goes backwards to the origins of experimental cinema and forward to the present at the time in the 90s and beyond. And this lineage finds its material expression in the archive. Films to be screened were not rented, as it usually happened, but they were acquired by the museum to become part of its collection. So Bertetto succeeded in establishing a new tradition. Acquisitions of experimental films would continue throughout the 90s, And in 1997, the museum purchased the materials that are going to embody the complexity of the archival life of Stan Brakhage in Turin, that are his hand-painted films, related to his 1995 title, Spring Cycle. All these acquisitions, I want to underline this, were a very bold curatorial move on the part of Bertetto, as the Cinema Museum's core collections were, and still are, related to Italian silent cinema, with an emphasis on silent cinema from Turin, and especially to the so-called pre-cinema, even though I know it's a term that should not be used, but just for ease, I'm going to use it, to pre-cinema artifacts. In fact, the museum hosts one of the world's largest and most varied collections of magic lanterns lights, which are one of the museum's main attractions for visitors and researchers. But the relationship between these experimental films and the broader museum collection is, I believe, a perfect example of that dialectical relationship between archival films and the institutions. Insofar as the case of these films is going to show, they have been mutually influencing one another. In 2010, the museum undertook a preservation campaign of its experimental cinema holdings, including this. The timing was not random at all. Around the same time, Donata Pesenti Campagnoni, who is still the senior curator of the Cinema Museum, and Laurent Manoni from the Cinémathèque Française, were co-curating a big and influential exhibition, which opened in Paris in 2009 and was then expanded for its 2011 Italian run here in Turin. This exhibition was dedicated primarily to the magic lantern. However, as you can see here, its complete title is Magic Lantern and Painted Film, 400 Years of Cinema, thus making visible and elaborating on the connection between pre-cinema, early cinema, and avant-garde cinema that already Tom Gunning had unveiled in his essay on the cinema of attractions. But for the Cinema Museum, it was more than that. It was a way for finding unity in the diversity of its collection, to establish connections between its archival holdings, and in so doing, expanding the idea of what film is. To understand the extent of this mechanism, I'd like to take a look at the hand-painted materials and how they were preserved and exhibited. So as I mentioned, they were related to the 1995 film Spring Cycle. Let me go back so that you have them in front of you. No, I'm not going back. That's okay. Stay there. All right. You remember, they're hand-painted, they're pretty. Okay, where was I? So I say related to the film Spring Cycle because none of the film reels in the museum's possession represents the entire work. According to Marilyn Brakhage, Stan's second wife, these films were in fact preprint materials that were supposed to be used as elements to manipulate at the printing stage in order to achieve Brakhage's desired effect in the final print. You can see here the instructions that Brakhage wrote for printing Spring Cycle. I don't know if you can read, but I can, trust me, they are incredibly complicated. This is confirmed by the label Mebius that was on some of the original film cans, which testifies that they were basically film elements that were taped in the shape of a Mebius loop. That's basically a loop with a half twist in it. And they were supposed to be superimposed one to the other at the printing stage. So in itself, the film was not the finished work at all. It needed to be manipulated much further in order to become then the finished work that he would call Spring Cycle. This is a technique that Brakhage, according to Toscano, and actually to Marilyn Brakhage herself, used also in other films, such as The Birds of Paradise from 1998. So this brings us back to the issue of originality, because in this case, what is an original? So the original in the form of a text is clearly the finished print that the museum does not have. But the original, how can we say that those hand-painted films are not original insofar that they bear the traces of the artist's hand itself, but they're original more as objects than as text again. But what is interesting is that the preservation strategy of Turin kind of went along with this idea of originality, because the film archive in Turin, again, has preserved these 4 hand-painted reels separately, so treating each one of them as an original. And this decision was perfectly in tune with the strategy designed by the curators for the Magic Lantern exhibition. Don't forget that the preservation of these films was made in time for the exhibition itself. So in the exhibition, the spectator's itinerary was organized in sections following a thematic order and encompassed lantern slides projection, pre-cinema artifacts, video art performances. But unlike all the other experimental films, Spring Cycle was not projected as part of the exhibition, but its 4 reels were on display as objects, again, with a materiality that transcends their nature as moving images. And this choice succeeds in creating connections between the world of cinema, that of the fine arts, with the consequences that this shift has on the practice of archiving, exhibition, film's nature, and everything that we have been discussing so far. So to conclude, both Boulder and Turin repositioned the conceptual nature of film by approaching it as an artifact, as an object, rather than as a means for projecting moving images. But each of them did so differently and according to its own institutional history and identity, thus giving different afterlives to these materials while concurrently being shaped by them. Boulder's films reflect the legacy the Brackage left on its campus, while the Turin experience, thanks to the peculiarity of the museum's collections, highlights the connection between the Magic Lantern and experimental cinema as forms of art belonging simultaneously to the realm of artifact and projected image, thus broadening the concept of attraction and, I would argue, that of cinema itself. In both cases, more traditional approaches to experimental films are by no means excluded, and we've had screenings these days that testify to that. Still, what I find interesting is that different exhibition strategies are possible. And what the Boulder and Turin case show is how the film's nature cannot be reduced to a means to an end, the end being the projection. Especially in our digital age, the peculiarities of film's material nature become more evident, thus inviting different ways to approach it. Experimental cinema emphasizes the specificity of this material nature and its closeness to other visual arts. But all cinema has this power. So every film object, every film print is unique. It's just more apparent in experimental cinema than in other types of cinema. But as such, a unique object has the potential for becoming something else outside of the narrative, experimental, or documentary text that it embodies. This something else can be availed also by investigating its archival afterlife. Thank you. Shall I close this? Should I leave it open? I'll leave it open.
Yeah, leave it open.
It's gonna be a 4-hour recording, I think.
So, maybe there are questions. Yeah, I have a question. Come here, please. No, come here. You have to speak inside. No. You have to speak into the mic.
It's exhibited, and also it says Amsterdam 23rd or something.
Yes.
Exhibition.
So the film was exhibited, it was in a glass case, so exhibited like a lantern slide as an object. It says Amsterdam because it was restored in Amsterdam, and these photos were taken in Amsterdam. So the person who restored the film sent me the photos, and so that's why it says Amsterdam. But the exhibition was first in Paris and then in Turin. It didn't travel further, but there's a beautiful catalog that I do recommend if you can still find it, that has a lot of beautiful pictures. But yes, it was, as I said, they're not long fragments, so they were exhibited, yes, in a case.
Okay, more questions? Maybe not. It has been a long day. So I think we can compliment ourselves for the good job we did. And let's see, now we stop the recording and we go to dinner. Goodbye.